Okay, let's unpack this. When you think about the incredible cultural complexity, the demographics of Jamaica, often the history, focuses on the monumental contributions of its African and European heritage.
Hmm.
But there is a massive and historically, well, often overlooked component that defines the island today, the East Indian community.
That's absolutely right. And for you listening, we are diving deep into the history of how this community actually came to be the largest ethnic minority in Jamaica.
Right.
We're tracking a complicated path. It began with temporary labor contracts,
Yeah.
indentured servitude, essentially, but systematically ended in permanent, de facto settlement.
That is the core mission of this deep dive. Our sources, they meticulously detail the movement of East Indians to the island between, 1845 and 1916?
Yeah, that's the period.
And the focus here isn't just on the labor itself, but really on the broken promises, the policy mechanisms, and the economic pressures that converted an intended short-term stay into a permanent foundation of Jamaican society.
And we have to start with the statistic that, well, it instantly reveals the fundamental flaw, or perhaps the fundamental intention, of the entire system. Approximately 37,000 Indians immigrated to Jamaica during that 71-year period.
Okay.
The stated goal for the vast majority was pretty simple: work, save money, and return home to India with enough capital to improve their lives.
So if that was the intent, what was the retention rate? I mean, how many actually went home in the end?
The figures are astonishingly low. Only 38% of those 37,000 ultimately repatriated.
Only 38%.
Yeah. That means the overwhelming majority, nearly two-thirds, settled permanently. They stayed contrary to their original, driving intent. Today, they represent about 3% of the Jamaican population.
So the core mystery we need to solve is, what systemic roadblocks ensure that 62% of these temporary laborers never actually left?
Exactly. What kept them there?
So the key is understanding the conditions they stepped into. Let's rewind to the pivotal moment when this process began, May 10th, 1845. The ship was the SS Blundell, docking at Old Harbour, carrying the very first group of 261 Indian indentured workers. A small group, relatively speaking, 200 men, 28 young women, and 33 children.
And the immediate reality of life upon arrival was harsh. I mean, it was designed purely for function, not comfort or integration. Our sources paint a very stark picture of what these workers received as a kind of startup kit.
What did they get?
They were given a single change of clothing, basic agricultural tools like hoes or machetes, and cooking pots. That was it.
That was the entirety of their provision to begin a 5-year contract in a totally foreign land.
Pretty much.
And the housing situation sounds immediate and immediately dire.
Oh, absolutely. They were divided into groups, maybe 20 to 40 people, and transported immediately, at first by these bumpy mule carts, or later jammed into overcrowded freight trains straight to the plantation.
Right, spread out across the island.
Yeah, properties scattered everywhere, places like Portland, St. Thomas, St. Mary, Clarendon, Westmoreland.
And the pay? Was it decent at least?
No, the stipends were set scandalously low. Sources indicate the pay rate was actually less than what was currently being offered to the ex-slaves, who are now technically free to negotiate their labor.
Less than former slaves. So they were really at the bottom rung.
It forced the indentured laborers into an impossible economic position from day one. Really squeezed them.
And the living conditions themselves, you mentioned crowded.
Abysmal. When we say crowded, we mean it. Several families, sometimes, 10 to 20 people, often had to share a single room in these sort of barrack-style buildings.
Wow. Just imagine that.
Think about the physical and emotional burden. Beyond the lack of space, there was profound cultural hardship. The overwhelming majority of these arrivals were Hindu,
Right.
but zero provision was made for their cultural or religious practices. If you have 7 families crammed into one room, where do you find the space for the privacy for, proper religious observances, or even just preparing food according to custom? It was incredibly difficult.
It sounds like a kind of physical and spiritual confinement. And critically, they were essentially tied to the land, weren't they?
Yes, they were. They were not allowed to leave the plantation grounds without securing a permit first. It just reinforces the captive nature of their labor, even though they were technically free workers under contract.
That initial ways in 1845, you said it was small, but it didn't stay that way.
No, that was just the test run, really. Once the system was deemed viable by the planters, the influx exploded. We see 1,852 East Indians arriving in 1846, and then a staggering 2,439 in 1847 alone.
Wow.
The demand for cheap, controlled labor was just insatiable.
But what's terrifying is how the source material details that the inherent fraud in the system wasn't some kind of mistake. It sounds like it was actually built into the recruitment process itself.
Well, what's fascinating here is that we have this report from H.N.D. Bates. He was the protector of immigrants. And his report, which was intended for colonial oversight, is surprisingly candid about the dark side of the system. Bates documents the manipulation happening back in India on that side of the ocean.
What stands out to you in terms of the language he uses? Because that suggests a level of official awareness, doesn't it?
The language is damningly explicit. Bates writes that the laborers, whom he refers to using the term coolies, were ensnared by unprincipled intermeddlers.
Ensnared? That's strong language.
It is. This wasn't just, misleading employment advertising. He states flat out they were grossly deceived.
Grossly deceived. So basically, involuntary migration in many cases. How did the recruiters manage to mask this level of fraud from colonial oversight, even if Bates eventually documented it?
It seems like it was a bit of a shell game. Bates cites workers who, say, wanted to go to a specific colony, maybe Trinidad, where they knew people or heard better things.
Right.
But instead, they were taken fraudulently and without their consent to the depot of another colony. They'd sign a contract believing they were going one place, only to find themselves on a ship bound for Jamaica.
Why Jamaica specifically?
Often due to higher commissions paid to the recruiters for that specific destination, more money for the middleman.
And it wasn't just misdirection, was it? The report documents coercion that sounds terrifyingly close to outright kidnapping.
It does. Bates cites some extreme examples of cruelty designed purely to pressure compliance. He describes women being enticed away from their husbands, lured away, and families being held in durance, that basically means held in captivity, specifically to coerce the male workers into signing the contracts and fulfilling their indentureship.
So the contract was voluntary only on paper?
Pretty much. The reality was deceit and duress from day one for many.
It's clear that the workers arrived under, well, often false pretenses, and then endured horrific living conditions for the duration of their contracts. But the system had one final crucial obligation. Repatriation, right?
Yeah.
The trip home they were promised.
Exactly. And this brings us to the next critical phase, around 1879, where the policy shifts dramatically. The planters lobby the owners. They realize they had zero economic interest in paying for the passage home.
Of course not.
They had invested years in training these workers, acclimatizing them, and now they were obligated to fund their exit. No. The calculus shifted from managing temporary labor to, well, trapping permanent settlement.
So they successfully lobbied the government, get incentives for the Indians to stay in Jamaica instead of leaving. This led to that famous 1879 compromise.
Which was really a kind of double bind. At the end of their contract, workers were offered a choice, either 10 to 12 acres of land or a cash payout.
Okay, that sounds like an opportunity on the surface. Land or cash.
It sounds like it, but the sources reveal the true nature of that land offer.
Meaning the quality wasn't up to par. Or usable.
Far from it. Most of the plots being offered were located in mountainous and infertile areas. They were often completely unusable for profitable, sustained agriculture, just rocks and hillsides.
Ah, I see.
So naturally, many immigrants understood the poor quality of the land and chose the cash grant instead. It made more sense.
Makes sense.
By 1877, the government had spent close to £32,000 on these cash grants, and the colonial administration decided, whoa, that's far too much outflow of capital.
And this is where the policy becomes the final systematic trap, isn't it? The government couldn't stop the workers from choosing the cash, so they just removed the option.
Exactly. In 1879, the government suspended the cash option entirely. Gone.
Just like that.
This forced the worker into choosing the poor quality land grant, which was often useless, or staying without receiving any compensation or assistance at all. It was an economic strong-arm tactic, plain and simple.
What's truly revealing about the colonial mindset here is the financial calculation behind this. It sounds like they deliberately made the bad choice the only choice, even if the alternative wasn't actually much cheaper for the government itself.
That's the most cynical part of the policy switch, I think. The sources show that even offering the land grants and setting up these settlements, it still cost the government approximately £12 per person.
Okay, £12 for the land grant setup.
Now consider the cost of actually fulfilling the original contract and repatriating a person back to India. That cost was only £15 per person.
Wait, only £15. So they were willing to spend £12 to coerce someone to stay, rather than spending just £3 more, £15, to honor the contract and send them home.
Precisely. That 3-pound difference per person tells you everything about the priority. It was about systematically manufacturing a permanent, cheap labor population.
That financial decision fundamentally reframed the contract, didn't it? Shifting the state's obligation from guaranteed repatriation to essentially mandated retention.
It speaks volumes about where the economic value was truly placed on retaining the labor in the colony, regardless of the contractual promises or the human cost.
And this systematic tightening, it just continued relentlessly, didn't it? Into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, repatriation became more difficult and more costly almost every year.
Absolutely. The land grants themselves became unreliable even after the cash option was suspended. They were suspended again in 1897, briefly resumed in 1903, and then finally withdrawn altogether in 1906.
So even that bad option disappeared.
Yeah. But the barriers didn't stop there. For those who had somehow managed to save some money and still desperately wanted to go home, new financial hurdles were introduced specifically to make the voyage prohibitively expensive.
What kind of extra costs were they forced to bear, on top of surviving on those already low stipends?
Well, they now had to pay for a significant portion of their own passage home. Male immigrants were required to pay up to half of their passage fare,
Half the fare.
and females up to 1/3. And just to complicate things further, make it even harder, they were also required to cover the cost of necessities for the journey, things like blankets and warm clothing.
Which the shipping company or government should have provided.
You'd think so. For people operating on subsistence wages, maybe saving tiny amounts over years, requiring half the passage fee was basically an insurmountable obstacle for most, even if they had fulfilled their initial contract terms.
And even if a family somehow, miraculously, managed to raise the funds, there were logistical nightmares too, right? That often served as the final executioner of the plan to go home.
Yeah, our sources detail that the government required ships to be completely full to justify the considerable expense of sailing all the way from Jamaica back to India.
So departure dates were uncertain.
Totally unpredictable, often postponed for months, even years, just waiting, hoping.
That must have been agonizing.
And when a ship was finally ready to sail, it was often hopelessly oversubscribed because you had thousands of people stuck in this queue waiting on these indefinite departure schedules.
So what happened then?
It led to agonizing choices. Families were frequently forced to face splitting up. Maybe some could get passage, others had to be left behind hoping for the next ship.
Terrible.
Or the whole family had to wait indefinitely for the next opportunity, which they knew might never actually arrive.
And then the ultimate geopolitical roadblock just sealed the fate for so many of the remaining community.
Yeah.
The final group of Indian immigrants landed in Jamaica in 1914.
And just as that final group arrived, the world plunged into World War I.
Right.
The war immediately curtailed almost all civilian ocean travel, and many ships that might have been used for repatriation were recommissioned for the war effort. It made organized, large-scale movement impossible.
So the system, the whole possibility of repatriation, essentially just collapsed under the weight of the war.
It did. The possibility of fulfilling that original contract simply evaporated for thousands. While the very last organized group of repatriates did manage to leave Jamaica in 1929, long after the war.
That late, 1929.
Yes, but by that time, the vast majority had long since settled, put down roots, maybe started families, integrated themselves as best they could into the landscape of the island.
Their initial intent, the whole reason they came, earn money and return home, had been systematically defeated by policy, by economic pressure, and then finally by global conflict.
That's the trajectory.
This deep dive has clearly shown that the story of East Indian migration to Jamaica, well, it wasn't really a story of choice for many, was it?
Yeah.
It was a migration that was intended to be temporary, maybe 5 years, maybe 10, yet it was systematically converted into permanent settlement through layer after layer of deliberate economic pressure, regulatory manipulation, and logistical barriers.
And if you reflect on that financial calculation we talked about, the 12-pound versus 15-pound cost difference, the cost of coercive settlement versus the cost of simply honoring a contract,
Yeah.
what does this reveal about the underlying colonial approach to immigration policy and maybe even labor value itself? That systematic use of economic coercion to create a permanent population base is often the overlooked knowledge, the missing piece. When we discuss the modern cultural makeup of countries like Jamaica today, it wasn't just accidental.